Hey everyone. Just wanted to do a video here. Last night I started listening to some of Bill Burr's podcasts. I don't know if you've ever heard of him. He's a comedian. Not really the cleanest comedian, that's for sure. And I wouldn't even necessarily recommend listening to his podcast, but he's a very funny guy. He's very insightful on many different points. He's one of those smart guys that always uh, talks as talks of himself as if he's dumber than he actually is. But anyway, the point there is he a lot of his comedy centers around basically men's frustrations with women when they're in relationships. If you've ever watched some of his comedy, you would know that. For this reason, a lot of feminists don't really like him, but I think most people can kind of relate to what he's saying. And it got me to thinking because I've sort of run across a lot of those videos on the internet where there's you have like the Bill Burr take on women, or you could call it like being red pilled on women. You have the MGTOWs, the men going their own way, which is basically men who've decided that women aren't worth the effort in pursuing, and they're just going to go their own way, or they're not worth giving up what they would say is half your life to a woman. So they would be talking about getting married and everything like that, and then having the woman divorce you later on and taking half of your stuff, right? And so what I wanted to talk about is that if you've ever listened to anything like this, if you've ever been like quickly red pilled on women, you'll notice that a lot of what they're saying is kind of true. For example, I watched this. It was actually a woman who did this one video. I can't remember her name off the top of my head, but she did a video in which she was talking about the way in which little girls grow up and how they play with their dolls and how they try to use their words when they're playing with their dolls to quote unquote like manipulate their dolls, right? They're play acting with their dolls, and they're coming up with ways when they're little girls inside their heads to manipulate the doll. Oh, hey, little doll, do you want to go to the beach with me? No, I don't. Oh, that makes me really sad, type thing. They're doing stuff like that. I don't know how true that is, but something I heard Bill Burr say last night is he was talking about like 5 or 6 ways in which women will try to manipulate men, right? And by the way, if you're watching this, you're a woman, or you're like, whoa, 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 you're going too hard into women, just bear with me. I'm just making some points here. So Bill Burr is talking about the 5 or 6 ways that women will try to manipulate men when they're not getting their own way. And if you're a man, you'll know that's like had a girlfriend, or maybe you've dated some bad women in the past. You'll know how true this is, right? You'll know how manipulative it can get at times, right? So I was thinking about this, and I've had these things where I've heard like the MGTOW thing and everything like that, and I was like, it's not that all of their points on the quote unquote nature of women are wrong. It's that they're looking at it from the wrong perspective. And so, because the other thing I've noticed is that the criticisms of men you hear are from like feminists, right? They're usually not from, well, it's weird because it's like when you'll criticize men, men will often go like, huh, yeah, that's kind of true. We're kind of, like if you said, for example, oh yeah, men are really messy or something like that, men will go like, yeah, me personally, I'm not like that, but yeah, I know what you mean. Single guys, sometimes they need to clean up their act, or, men can be a little bit too focused on sex and men will be like, yeah, I see what you're saying, right? They're kind of like the cool kid, like the cool kid in high school when somebody makes like an insult or whatever, and he's just like, ha. And then there's like the kid where you insult them and they get like, or they get criticized and they get really defensive. It's just, for some reason that's not as fun to criticize them. But then you have like the feminists on the other hand, where it's like their criticisms are like kind of dumb. You know what I mean? I'm not saying that all of their criticisms of men are incorrect. Like, oh, this toxic masculinity. It's like, I actually believe that there is this thing called toxic masculinity. I think they're right in having a term like that. Just as there's toxic masculinity, which would be like the toxic form of masculinity, you could have a toxic form of femininity, right? So in their minds, like the toxic masculinity would be like really aggressive behavior, stuff like that. Or thinking like one thing men definitely do, a real good criticism of men when it comes to like what women might say is, you have like, you say hi to a guy and then he thinks that means that you like him, right? And yeah, I mean, those criticisms are definitely valid, right? Okay, so having said that, I was thinking about a lot of this where I was like, yeah, a lot of these criticisms of the opposite sex, whether you're male or female, are actually true. And for what's going on right now is you have a bunch of men who are really dissatisfied with the nature of women, and then you'll have a bunch of women at the same time who are really dissatisfied with the nature of men. Okay, so I'm like, that's not good, number one, because it's like, think about that. Like, just think about that from like, I mean, just even a secular perspective, just from like a scientific perspective of a species who or like a large number of the males and a large number of the females are really unsatisfied with each other. Like, you need to have babies, right? And so you start looking at that and it's like, that's really not good. When you have that many people, where you have basically what you have are humans who are figuring out that the entire love game is a genetic trap, right? Or it's like, yeah, I know that, like you'll have men on the internet saying that, oh, well, if it wasn't for my sex drive, I wouldn't even want to be with a woman. I mean, incredibly insulting sort of things like that, just because they're that frustrated. And I'm sure there's women like that as well. They're like, if it wasn't for my particular inclinations, I wouldn't even want to be with a man, because all of the men I've been with are really bad to be with. They have all of these tendencies. They can't stop themselves from checking another girl out. Even when I'm around him, they can't do this, they can't do that. They have all of these issues. And then, yeah, men on the other hand are like, I don't want to be with a woman because, she's very manipulative. She's, when we have fights, she's not being logical about things. She's trying to use emotions on me to manipulate me. That's very frustrating for men. And then for women, on the other hand, when men act in their sort of toxic way, it's very frustrating for women, right? So, like I said, that's not good even genetically or like in a like scientific evolutionary sort of aspect, right? So basically, like this view starts to develop when you take a step back and look at this without God, right? Where you're like, okay, so what's going on here is that people are trapped by their genetics because, like if you look at the mating ritual from like an evolutionary standpoint, you need to mate in order to produce offspring, right? Like that's the entire evolutionary theory, is that, if you don't reproduce, that means your species isn't going to survive, right? And so this inclination to reproduce is part of the species, or is part of your like genetics. right? Because you wouldn't be here right now, and the ones that won't do that will die off and not pass down their genetics, right? Um, but what's happening now is you have people looking at this entire thing and they're going like, okay, I'm trapped by my genetics. And if it wasn't for my genetics, like if I didn't have this sex drive, I would not even bother with the opposite sex because it's not worth it. It's just too much of a hassle and everything like that. And so it's as if they're like humans are almost too smart for their own good in that aspect. If we were just animals, right? We're more than just animals, but it's like we can take a step back and look at it and be like, oh no, that's this is a trap, like basically what they're saying is it's a very nihilistic thing of like real love doesn't exist. And that's because they're right. It in their sense, in the sense that they're thinking of it, real love doesn't exist, right? And that's because in the sort of current Western dating pool, or the current Western understanding of relationships, we have it all wrong, right? And so, like I said, all of like you go watch so many of these criticisms of the opposite sex, you can take a step back and go like, yeah, that's 100% true, or that's like 90% true. And if you don't know any better, that's going to really depress you, because you'll have people that like hear about this. So you have like groups of people that will hear about these truths about the opposite sex, and you'll have like the one group, they hear about it, or you have like a group of people who've never heard about this stuff, right? They're just like blissfully unaware. Okay. And you have a second group of people who hear about it and just deny it because it's a very uncomfortable fact, which it is, right? If you don't know how to handle it, you're going to be like, you're going to swear off the opposite sex. And then you have another group of people who hear about it and they get very despondent about it, and they believe it as true, and then they're like, they swear off the opposite sex. And then you have a fourth group of people who hear about it and then they can transcend it. Because why can they transcend it? It's because they know that God is the one who created us. Right? And they can see that we have a sinful nature, or we have, concupiscence, we have original sin. And so they can see that, and they can see that we have this inclination to do sinful things. And that's what we would call, let's say, toxic masculinity or toxic femininity. And so what I started thinking about last night when I was watching this, it reminded me of all of those like different videos I've seen that were talking about like female nature, getting red pilled on women, whatever you want to call it. And what it made me think of is the fact that this doesn't happen when society has properly structured marriage, right? When society has properly put structures around marriage. And it's because it's very hard for people to carry out their different schemes. Like a lot of these problems stem from free sex, right? A lot of them just stem from people having the wrong view of sex, right? So it's again, the one example of women being very manipulative and everything like that. Like, if you are trapped in a marriage and you know that there's no way out, and that you can't even get birth control, a lot of the problems surrounding, that you'd have with like the average person from the opposite sex kind of disappear, because it's like, you can't have, it's like once you're trapped in that, you have to behave. You have to make it work. But if you're not trapped in that, you can get really unsatisfied because, I could be somewhere else. I could blah, 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 blah. And so that's just kind of what happens. People just sort of accept their lot. Like, take, for example, the idea of women being very manipulative. So one of the ways in which women can manipulate men is through the use of sex, right? Or the promise of sex. Well, if it so happens that you're in a marriage, a good Catholic marriage, where, by the way, it's a mortal sin to reasonably deny or deny a reasonable request for the marriage bed or the marital contract or the marital obligation, that use of manipulation is no longer there. And if you're a man who goes into a marriage understanding that, oh, actually, the only time we're really going to be having sex, or not the only time, but when we have sex, it's to procreate and to bond with each other. This isn't a tool of recreation. It can be, it can be fun and everything like that, I'm sure. But, this isn't for that. If you have men understanding that when they go into a marriage, then it's a lot harder to manipulate them as well, right? So on both sides, it's harder for the person to do that. But once we remove all of the rules surrounding marriage and everything like that, marriage and sex, then we basically end up seeing the worst of each other, right? Because there's a reason why we had those rules. We didn't just put rules in place because we're wanted to be, Puritans, or, we wanted to be like these people that are like what the church has been accused of as being obsessed with sex. It's like, no, it's because this is actually important. I mean, again, it boggles my mind how much secular people talk about things like evolution and then don't actually believe in it, right? Because from an evolutionary standpoint, the Catholic Church is really good at getting people to reproduce, right? From an evolutionary standpoint, it's really good at it. Not only is it really good at it, it produces the proper structures in which people are actually going to want to reproduce, right? In which they're actually going to do it. And so this idea, and then you have secular people who are like, oh yeah, evolution's true, so, rules, who cares about that? I'm not saying all secular people are like that, but it's incredible to me how many people talk about the theory of evolution who don't actually understand it. They talk about it and then they completely deny natural law, right? They're like, oh yeah, there is no God, it's only nature. And I'm like, okay, well, if you don't believe in God, at least believe in nature. But they don't even believe in that. And of course not, because again, there's very few people who are like that. Like, one of them would be a guy who used to be on YouTube. He got banned, Stephen Molyneux. He was like that, where he didn't believe in God, but he believed in nature. He had this understanding of the natural law and everything like that. But we've gone beyond that, where people are just completely divorced from reality, right? Where it's like, oh yeah, survival of the fittest. And I'm like, so you're not going to procreate though? And they're like, nah, I don't want a kid. And I'm like, don't you think then that's saying that you're not one of the fittest? Aren't you, you're telling me that you got here because people were procreating and you're not at all interested in procreating, and not because you want to be a priest either, right? Because that's what, it's like, I was telling somebody a while back, where it's like, the MGTOW movement, men going their own way. We're not going to deal with women. I'm like, yeah, what you used to do when you wanted to do that is just become a priest, right? Because it was either get married or become a priest, right? Those were your choices. You weren't going to be going around having a bunch of free sex. You're either going to get married or become a priest. But again, once you get rid of all of these rules, people start seeing the worst of each other, because there's a reason why we put the rules there in the first place. And I think that's a very important thing to realize, is that without rules, without the proper structures surrounding it, and again, I'm not trying to be judgy and anything like that and be like, oh, you scumbag, you whatever. It's like, I get that people have a hard time with some of this stuff. I'm saying, let's at least if you're a secular person, at least understand that we need to restructure this entire thing, restructure the way we're dealing with this, because it's not working for either sex, right? We can't have half the population upset with the other half of the population and be like, yeah, if it wasn't for, my sex drive, I wouldn't even deal with these people, right? Like, that's not a good thing. And so if that's what's happening, maybe we need to like rethink this thing a little bit, or maybe we need to look at things we've had in the past surrounding it and say, oh yeah, actually reproduction is a good thing. People reproducing is a good thing. And sex isn't a toy. We can't just fool around with it. Like, again, just to hit on the same point, to beat the same dead horse here, when you have secular people talking about how much they believe in evolution, and then at the same time they say, oh yeah, the most important thing in evolution, by the way, is reproduction, right? Being able to survive to a age where you can reproduce and then reproduce. That's the most important thing in the theory of evolution, right? If you're going to survive as a species, you need to be able to do that. Be able to reproduce offspring who are going to be able to survive to the age of a mature enough age where they can reproduce more offspring. That's how it works. And so to be like, oh yeah, I believe in the theory of evolution. I don't believe in this. I blah, 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 blah. And then you're going to tell me that you don't think there needs to be any rules surrounding sex. That tells me that you're a dishonest person, right? Because guess what? The society that has rules surrounding sex is going to do the reproduction thing way better than the society that doesn't, right? Because you want to look at societies who don't reproduce that much. It's the societies that don't have any rules surrounding it, or the ones with less rules reproduce less. And then you could say, oh yeah, well, the less you reproduce, the more resources and stuff like that, the more you reproduce, the more the planet's going to be polluted and it's just going to kill everything off. Well, actually, no, because it's the people who aren't reproducing that are consuming the most, right? You can't consume a bunch of stuff. You can't be consumeristic when you have a family to feed and you're the single income in that household or whatever, right? You have kids to take care of. You have all of this. And when you understand that it's like, oh, actually, no, I can't just be like really self-indulgent all the time. I have responsibilities. You're not going to be consuming as much, right? And that's very important. And not only that, when you have monogamous relationships, so if you have basically like, and I'm not saying you have to enforce these using government force, I'm just saying like, sometimes you can have rules that are like enforced through social pressure and stuff like that. But when you have like, let's say a rule, like a soft rule saying like, yeah, no sex before marriage type thing. Well, what ends up happening is that men don't actually have to compete as much for women, right? And the reason why that's a good thing is because then they don't actually have to spend as, like, women can't be as demanding on resources, right? And again, the reason why that's a good thing is because women are actually the ones who spend the most money, right? They're the ones spending the money. And they're the ones spending money on a lot of different products, right? That's who a lot of advertisers are targeting. Like, if you ever wonder why women's clothing is more expensive, it's just because women are way more concerned with spending more money on clothing. Like, guys will have like shirts that they've had for years, and there's like, yeah, maybe a few holes in it, like not big holes, just little holes, and they're like, yeah, what's the big deal? It's not that big of a deal. Whereas women may not, and again, generalization, but that's kind of the way it is. So yeah, and so the other reason, so like when men aren't competing for that sort of thing, when they don't have to compete as much, because what happens is, and again, I hope this isn't like news to a lot of people, but women aren't actually attracted to most men, right? Men are attracted to most women, generally speaking. Women are only attracted to like the top 20% of men, if that. And this has been proven, or this has been shown in studies. So they think only the top 20% of men are above average in attractiveness. So women are very picky, which again, because they're the ones with the eggs, they're the ones that have to carry a baby for 9 months. It makes sense, like just naturally speaking, that they'd be the one doing the selecting, right? Whereas men, men can get like 100 women pregnant hypothetically in like the course of a week if he was really trying, sort of thing, hypothetically speaking. But a woman can only get pregnant like once a year, sort of thing, right? And by one man. And so, of course, women have to be more selective. And that's a good thing, because then they're going to be choosing the men. But it's a bad thing if it becomes too selective, right? Where you have like 7 women getting pregnant by the same man. That's not good. We don't want that. Women don't like that. Number one, women don't like that, and men don't like that. Neither sex likes that. And then when that happens is women want to be able to get the man with a lot of resources so they can spend his money. And again, nothing wrong with that. I don't think there's anything wrong with women being interested in the amount of resources a man has, no more than I think there's anything wrong with a man being interested in how beautiful a woman is. It shouldn't be the only thing you're interested in, but there's nothing wrong with that. It is actually important for both genders, right? Because women need a man that's going to be able to provide for them when they're pregnant, when they're having babies and stuff, because guess what? They're kind of taken out for a little bit. They need to be able to have resources. And men, they want an attractive woman because that's a fertility marker, right? They want an attractive woman that says health, right? And so I think I may have lost my train of thought with that one, but basically, when you don't have rules, that's what ends up happening. You have a bunch of dissatisfied men, you have a bunch of dissatisfied women, right? Because women, they will actually be happy with a man that they maybe didn't think was the best looking, but if they were like, he's the best I could get type thing, they'll end up really learning to love him if he has a good heart and if he's not like effeminate. And what I mean by that, effeminate, is when men don't take responsibility. That's what that means. So if he takes responsibility and he has a good heart and, he's trying, let's say he's like actually, trying to stay in shape and everything, women will mostly be happy with that. If, that's, they've come to do that. But when you give them the option, which is when you take away the rules surrounding marriage, which is you can have sex before marriage, which is then you give them basically the option to be jump from relationship to relationship, they end up really unhappy because they're cycling around this sort of select number of guys, and those guys, because they have so many options with women, aren't usually the best sort of men for monogamy, right? Because they're so high up on the sexual market value. Since they have such a high sexual market value, men are by nature polygamous, and those men are sort of like not the best men for women to end up with all the time. I'm not saying all of those guys are like that, but again, if you're, men, like I said, are naturally sort of polygamous, right? And it creates a very, very bad situation when all of that goes on. And so I think that's like I said, we have to change those rules. We have to bring it back to understanding the nature, going like, men are naturally polygamous, women are naturally hypergamous. Let's create some rules so everyone's happy in the end, or everyone's kind of satisfied, and we have good functional relationships over the broad section of society. So that's kind of what I wanted to say. I know it kind of like went like this. I didn't prepare this video at all. I hope you liked it. I know it's been a few weeks since I got a video out. I did one on Saturday, but I didn't really like the way it went, and so here we go. Anyways, God bless. Take care.